Hi gang, been a while since I did a proper background history sort of video, isn't it? Well, I've noticed that Retrohammer Tube, yep, that's what it's called now, has been getting a bit aquatic over the last few months, and so in this video we're going to look at one of the oldest in-game factions, but also one of the oldest in miniature factions too. Magic Space Frogs. The Slan are one of the original factions detailed in the Rogue Trader rulebook, the first edition of Warhammer 40k released in 1987. Well, in this book they're called Slan, but the accompanying model range usually referred to them as Space Slan, because, like many of these early 40k factions, they were a direct port over from Warhammer Fantasy. At the time, Warhammer Fantasy Battles was on its third edition, also released a bit earlier in 1987, but the Slan have been part of the world since the very start. First edition Warhammer Fantasy was released in 1983, and it was very different to the mass battle game it would become, more a platoon or skirmish level war game with role-playing elements. It was expanded through scenario packs, a bit like campaigns in an RPG, which is pretty understandable for Games Workshop at the time. And each of these came with an associated set of miniatures and detailed a few sample battles for you to fight with them. One of these early scenario packs was The Legend of Kremlow the Slan. In this, Kremlow is a Slan abandoned as a baby and raised by Norse in their settlement of Skeggi in Lustria, the South America of the old Warhammer world, and Kremlow has to take over the Norse tribe and fight off raids by the nearby Slan. In this, we get the first mention in Warhammer of the Slan. The Slaad Empire lies in decline along the coast of central Lustria. They are an exceedingly ancient race. Some say that they are even older than the elves, though they are wrong. Yeah, that's going to change. But the basic idea is there. They're like ancient Mayan or Aztec influenced magic frog people who were previously really, really powerful, but are now in decline. There's not really much more detail given about them in this. The scenario came with a release of Slan models designed by Michael and Alan Perry, and you can tell that they're really old because the original set predates slaughter bases. These old models come with molded on bases, like D&D models of the time. Anyway, before I look ahead to 1987, let's ask a pretty simple question. Why did Warhammer include a load of magic frogmen anyway, especially so early on? At the time, Warhammer was pretty Tolkien-esque. Why was the one exception these guys? Well, the roots of that go back even further than Warhammer, when Games Workshop used to be the distributor for Dungeons & Dragons. White Dwarf back then was more of a generic gaming magazine, producing content for a number of role-playing games, and they used to run a regular Fiend Factory column in which staff and readers could submit their homebrew D&D monsters. Eventually, in 1981, TSR UK took a load of these Fiend Factory monsters, added a load of the unpublished ones that had been submitted but not used, and released it as a book called The Fiend Folio. And on page 80 of The Fiend Folio, we find the Slaad. The Slaad are a race of cute toad people. Actually, they're not very cute. They're like massive, scary monsters, but they look like cute toad people. Look at him. In D&D, they're residents of the plane of Limbo, sent by their mysterious masters to the prime material plane to enslave people. They come in various colours with the usual random mishmash of wildly different abilities common to D&D monsters from this era. A red frog guy and a blue frog guy are literally completely different with different magic and everything. You know. The Slaad are actually still in D&D, another franchise that very rarely gets rid of anything, but they are drawn to be a bit scarier looking nowadays. Anyway, the Slaad were written by a teenager by the name of Charles Stross, who is now quite a well-known fantasy and sci-fi author. And while they were never in a White Dwarf issue, a number of other monsters Charles submitted did make the cut, and Citadel made miniatures for D&D at the time and when Warhammer was released. And, well, look, there's no hard evidence for this, but I guess we might as well try and find a way of selling all these metal frogmen we just made, so I guess Warhammer suddenly has frogmen too. Buy our magic frogmen. Anyway, as the editions of Warhammer roll on, the Slan are kept in production. In Warhammer 2nd Edition's Battle Bestiary, we get a slightly more expanded version. The Slan are a unique race in the known world. Their origins are uncertain, but they appear to be descended from the ancient race of Old Slan. It's said that the High Age of the Slan was a golden era for all sentient creatures. It's probable that the Old Slan came from the stars, as Slan legend recalls. The Slan of today are a race fallen from power. They've turned their backs on the past and have grown to hate and fear the old technology. What brought about the decline of the Slan is not known. However, Slan legend connects this fall of the old Slan with galactic catastrophe and the creation of the incursions of chaos. So yeah, that's starting to sound a bit more familiar. And this new context comes with new models, this time by Trish Morrison, with comedy names to really undercut how serious and epic that bit of fluff sounded. Anyway, the comedy name thing would continue well into Warhammer Fantasy. By Warhammer 3rd Edition, they've evolved a bit, along with the rest of the old world. The previous fluff is basically reinforced. The Slan are an ancient race whose past and origin stretches beyond the horizons of the world. Once they roamed the stuff of chaos, moving between planets and their marvelous silver spaceships, seeding the universe with their genetic experiments. Ugh. The Slan themselves recall a time when their ancestors roamed the night skies, travelling between worlds in shining boats powered by forgotten magics. Such times belong to legend. Yeah, sounds like a setup, right? Because a few months later... So the Slan, despite their long pedigree, were never that popular, but early 40k loved a fantasy crossover, so they made it in. Here they are in Rogue Trader 1987. Of all the races in the galaxy, the Slan claim to be, and may actually be, the oldest. During the heyday of their empire, they discovered and nurtured many primitive creatures, eradicating or moving dangerous species, and seeding many planets with promising stock. For millennia, they experimented and played with the galaxy, possibly creating many of the races of modern times in the process. But their empire dwindled, the pace of their civilization slowed, and their genetic experiments were largely abandoned. The Slan retired from an active role in galactic affairs, falling into a long dream of indolence and introspection. They do not seem to have suffered from any physical conflict. There are no records of destructive wars or disasters. Instead, their racial motivations appear to have undergone a sudden and drastic change, so they've lost interest in material conquest and power. Perhaps the Slan discovered something yet unknown to other races, some secret of the universe, a spiritual truth or supreme mystical insight. So after a lot of hinting, they're finally here. The Slan are 40k's original dwindling ancient race. The Eldar of Rogue Trader are portrayed much more as an advanced but bored civilization. The Slan are arranged in tribal structures, and while they have a core of civilized worlds with a similar technological base, there are said to be other more primitive Slans scattered throughout the galaxy. Yeah, that's you, cup of cocoa. They're encountered either as traders, but since there's little the Slan want or need, traders often get the feeling that they're just being studied, or in battle as a warband led by a war leader. In all their random tables, they get all the weirder weapons of Rogue Trader: neurodisruptors, graviton guns, D-cannon, and apparently they make use of flyers and walkers, though there were never really any models for that sort of thing then. What was released was this selection of Space Slan in 1987, though obviously the names aren't quite as good. They're lovely models though, with various weird-looking weapons and some squat-like Rogue Trader quilted armour, but they were the only models ever released. So what happened to the Slan? Well, in fantasy, they'd disappear for a few years in the 90s, only to return as the leaders of the Lizardman army in Warhammer Fantasy 5th edition, and they've kind of stayed there since then. But in 40k, they had a bit more of a complex story. From 2nd edition onwards, Slan weren't directly referenced anymore, and some of their unique quirks, like the path of the warrior being a natural part of their life cycle, were adopted as the Eldar were further fleshed out. Instead, what the Slan were kind of replaced with was the Old Ones. The Old Ones were a pretty vague concept for most of the 1990s, a mythical alien race said to have been the original creators of the Webway, with no more information than that, and they weren't really expanded on until the release of the Necrons in the early 2000s and the development of the storyline for the War in Heaven, a great war between the Old Ones and the Catan in prehistory. First to cross the Sea of Stars were the Old Ones. They possessed a slow, cold-blooded wisdom, studying the stars and raising astrology and astronomy to arcane sciences. The Old Ones understood that all life is useful, and where they passed, they kindled new species and impregnated thousands of worlds. to make them their own. Sounds familiar, right? The Old Ones here aren't outright stated to be the Slan, but they're frequently described as a cold-blooded, long-lived, starfaring people who make new species like the Eldar and the Orcs, and whose technology is so advanced people think of it as magic. But the story of the War in Heaven doesn't really go any further than that in describing them, and ends with the Old Ones being defeated, sort of, and retreating from the galaxy. For a while, the Old Ones were just an ambiguous concept. They weren't necessarily associated with the Slan, but since then a few sources have started to use Old Ones and Old Slan, or Slanny, interchangeably. Admittedly, the Old Slan bit of that is quite early. Right back in 1989, the Codex Titanicus expansion to Adeptus Titanicus lists Old Slan as the people who taught the Eldar everything they knew. This is repeated even now. The 2018 version of Adeptus Titanicus lists the Slanny as the species that presaged the Eldar as rulers of the galaxy. The 2007 background book Xenology makes it clear that the Hrud's gods are the Slan and have a similar story about the War in Heaven. Hell, even the Horus Heresy books Old Earth and Legion, which feature a shadowy group of ancient species called the Cabal, feature a character called Garhet, described as an extremely powerfully psychic lizard guy who at least at one point is seen standing atop a stepped pyramid. And there was an image published in the 4th edition 40k rulebook of this old Slanny, which, yeah, pretty much looks quite like the original models. There's no concrete explanation here. We don't know if in current 40k the Slan are meant to be the Old Ones, or the Slan are meant to be a species that served the Old Ones, like they did in Warhammer Fantasy, or the remnants of the Old Ones Empire who, like in Rogue Trader, have forgotten what they used to be. Like many things in 40k, it's deliberately left mysterious, but it's clear that, at least in concept, the Old Ones are a development of and a spiritual successor to the ancient Slan fluff from Rogue Trader and early Warhammer Fantasy. And while that's nice, I like that 40k never really throws anything away, I can't help thinking that they missed the trick here. One of the main themes of 40k is the idea that advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic or religion, and is treated as such in the world. We see this everywhere in 40k, from the mastery of warp technology that leads the Old Ones to being treated as gods, to the Catan, just really powerful energy beings that the Necrons see as gods, to the whole concept of the warp and chaos, or the machine spirits of the Mechanicum. All of these are presented in 40k as either so technologically advanced, so powerful, or so alien and other that we just can't understand them and treat them as magic. For me, the ancient space Slan were a nice element within that, a species that had advanced so much technologically that they just looked like they weren't using it anymore. A species that still fulfilled that role of the ancient advanced race that are progressed beyond technology, but instead of ascending, still remained in world and just looked really primitive to outsiders. I think that would have been a really nice way to reinforce that theme, rather than just making them another set of ancient gods. But then, I guess at the time the Old Ones were written into the backstory, well, apart from Chaos, they were the only set of ancient gods. Anyway, I'm off to eBay to look at the prices of some cute little space froggies and avoid buying any for another few months. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to hear more about all these crazy old Warhammer ranges, then there are more videos on my channel, and if you'd like to support the channel, click all the standard YouTube buttons below or head over to the Patreon link. See you next time.